Thank you very much, Sarah. Welcome to the panel, What Makes People Change? I have the honor to introduce our next three speakers. I will just say a few sentences, and if you look up in the book, it's really worth to read their biography. So I start with Professor Rafi Walden. He's a professor of surgery at the Shibam Medical Center and immediate past president of Physicians for Human Rights. And as I looked up in the internet, also the son-in-law of Shimon Peres. Awarded with several prizes. Then on the left, there is Rabbi David Rosen. He's an international director of interreligious affairs of the AHC and a member of a chief rabbinate of Israel's Committee for Interreligious Dialogue and serves on the Council of the Religious Institutions of the Holy Land. And he's also a past chair of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations and got a papal knighthood in recognition of his contribution to promoting Catholic-Jew reconciliation. Then welcome to Bruce Oppenheimer, Dr. Bruce Oppenheimer. He's a clinical psychologist and organizational consultant. And he received his PhD from Duke University. He has published in the field of group work and adult learning, and he's a specialist in group work, offering both therapy groups as well as group-based interventions in organizations. So, welcome. You all will give us now a little insight in your fields of work. Professor Walden, can I ask you to be our first speaker?
I think I'll stand up so it's better to see you. It is a better idea. Well, thank you, Professor Gasser, and I'm pleased and honored to address this audience. Oh, better now? Okay. I'm pleased and honored to address this audience. In the spirit of what Professor Gasser said, I'd like to tell you a small anecdote which marked me. As was mentioned, I'm a surgeon, I'm a vascular surgeon. As was mentioned before, I am a surgeon. As a matter of fact, I'm a vascular surgeon dealing with diseases and injuries to the blood vessels, and I'm at the Shibam Medical Center. So I called one night to the emergency ward to see a very severely wounded young man. And when I came there, I got some details. He's a young Palestinian, 15 years old, who was severely wounded in some incident with the Israeli army, probably stone throwing. He got his preliminary treatment in a local Palestinian hospital, and he came with a very brief, very laconic note of his name, Ahmed, and some very brief details of the first aid he was given in this hospital. Due to the severity and complexity of his wound, he was transferred to our hospital. When I came in the emergency ward, the first thing that struck me was his eyes. His eyes were very black. He was extremely pale. He had lost a lot of blood. And from his eyes, one could see at first look all the hatred one can imagine in the world. Considering us, although a hospital and medical personnel, still as representative of his enemies, those who almost killed him. I speak basic Arabic, so I approach him saying, Ahmed, hello, I am your doctor. I'd like you to tell me what you feel. Not a single word, only this eyes looking at me with all this hatred you can imagine. I insist, Ahmed, tell me, can you move a leg? Can you move your hand? Tell me, what does it hurt? Still not a single word. But Ahmed, please answer me. After a long moment, he's looking in my eyes and he utters from his clenched teeth one single word: jihad. But everybody knows what is jihad. Jihad is a holy war against infidels. There was a moment of silence in the version of then I hear a curse from one of the orderlies. They say, listen, we are trying to save his life, and he's giving us this terrorist Islamic propaganda, send him back to Nablus and let them treat him. So I quite think, and again, unfortunately, I started to examine it. And I said again, Ahmed, please tell me, can you move a leg? Tell me, how do you feel? Again, this look and one word: jihad. At this stage, I despaired for creating any dialogue, any useful dialogue with him, and we took him to the Old Wedding Theatre. I must say, I was feeling a sort of respect for this young man who, in this extreme condition, had the guts to defy us, whom he considered his enemy. And that was the talking piece, during the operation. Everybody's talking about Ahmed, and his jihad declarations. The operation was very long and very difficult and very complicated, and thanks heaven it ended successfully. It was morning already, and when I finished the operation, I asked, is there anybody from the family? I was told yes, his father is waiting outside. So I came out, the father came out. He was a doctor himself, speaking very decent English. From the group of men, they approached me and I introduced myself and gave him a brief report on the medical aspect. And then I could escape to listen. Ahmed is a tough boy. I can tell you a few words of what happened. So we're ever grateful for you for saving the life of my son. I have no words. Permit me one small correction. I'm Ahmed. His name is Jihad. Jihad was taken over by the Islamic propaganda, but basically it is a term that says one should perfect spiritually an approach, spiritual aspect. And there is a general in the Israeli Defense Force, Mishmar Gul, whose name is Jihad Kabbalan. I learned it later. But you see, considering myself a great humanitarian, I fell into the trap of preconceived ideas. This is a lesson which I dearly learned. I think at this case,
Professor Walden. So I would like to give the word to Dr. Oppenheimer for our next insight.
I've prepared a lecture for take about 20 minutes. So
that's okay, yes.
Okay. In this lecture, I shall address the question of change from a psychotherapist's point of view through a discussion of vengefulness and how, paradoxically, vengefulness can establish the conditions needed in order to execute positive change through the medium of group therapy. To do this, I'm relying on a valuable set of 3 articles by Miriam Berger, an Israeli clinical psychologist and group analyst, who in the book, Victimhood, Vengefulness, and the Culture of Forgiveness, written together with Avi Berman and Ivan Ulrich from Croatia, deals with these issues. There'll be 3 parts to the lecture. The first part will talk about vengefulness as a discredited emotion. The jihad on vengefulness, if one could say. The second part will be, what are vengeful wishes? What is contained in them beyond the obvious? And the third part will be vengefulness as a link towards reconnecting. I know that I'm saying things that are a bit sort of paradoxical. Too fast? No? All right. Let's move on. The dictionary definition of vengefulness is the desire to see another suffer. These words give rise to an almost automatic condemnation. And to discuss vengefulness in a positive context runs the risk of being almost automatically dismissed. This is true as well in the psychotherapeutic literature, where vengefulness is considered a, quote, byproduct of raw aggressiveness crude rage, or pathological narcissism. Typically, in the psychotherapeutic literature, vengefulness is described as shameful, mindless, infuriating, and primitive, revealing the deficiencies of its carrier. Cultures that encourage vengefulness, blood feuds, and vendettas are seen by Western eyes as backward, undeveloped, and barbaric. Given this massive and comprehensive condemnation, the emotion, we can refer to the emotion of vengefulness as an emotion that is socially discredited. It's not the only one, but it's one of the emotions that socially are condemned and disapproved of. What is the problem with social discreditation? The idea is that if an individual has to distance himself, if an individual feels that an emotion that he or her feels is socially discredited, is unworthy, it is likely that he or her will stop himself from acknowledging, from coming into contact with, or from experiencing the emotion, in this case vengefulness. This distancing can bring about what is referred to as disassociated self-states. That is, in ordinary language, a disavowal or a refusal to accept parts of our experience, a banishing from consciousness and awareness those parts of our inner world of which we are ashamed, and shame is connected to social discreditation. The negative results of this dissociation are well known. We may unconsciously project the so-called undesirable and discredited emotions onto others, hence the popularity of vengefulness as a theme, especially in literature and in film. And equally seriously, we become alienated from our inner world, which leads to alienation from others. In the clinic, in the psychotherapeutic clinic, the discrediting of vengefulness manifests itself as a therapeutic injunction to get on with your life. Therapists who sort of find it difficult to accept wishes for revenge and encourage a patient to really get beyond it and to put vengefulness behind them. This approach can leave the patient feeling isolated and shameful. To summarize thus far, I want to claim that vengefulness is a developmental asset and needs to be regarded as normal and legitimate. I distinguish, of course, as many people and therapists do, between feelings and actions, and want to be clear that vengeful action is indeed worthy of condemnation, even though that too is a blanket statement, which I think I would have some reservation about. But acceptance of vengeful wishes and emotions, of vengeful fantasies, help to reinforce the distinction between the individual's inner world and the world of others. Owning one's own emotions, however socially discredited and politically incorrect they may be, reinforces one's sense of self, reduces vulnerability, while strengthening emotional resilience and capacity for coexistence. Such are the advantages of self-acceptance. I want to bring a quote here that I take from the book, where somebody quotes Heinrich Heine, the great humanist. And the quote is, he confesses, "Mine is a most peaceable disposition. My wishes are a humble cottage with a thatched roof, but a good bed, good food, the freshest milk and butter, flowers before my window, and a few fine trees before my door. And if God wants to make my happiness complete, he will grant me the joy of seeing some 6 or 7 of my enemies hanging from those trees. Before their death, I shall, moved in my heart, forgive them all the wrong they did me in their lifetime. One must, it is true, forgive one's enemies, but not before they have been hanged." Okay, vengeful wishes. What are they all about? Let's look at the positive dimensions of vengefulness. Vengefulness represents the hope for a just world in which sins and outrages are punished. Vengefulness can restore a sense of agency and potency to the person who until then has seen himself or herself as a victim. It restores a sense of relevance, of power. Vengefulness can also summon help and sustain the hope that the outrage will be heard, will be acknowledged, it will be recognized, and that the individual himself will be seen as a subject, not merely as a victim. What are the clinical implications of these ideas? The therapist should be extremely alert for injuries and injustices that have been inflicted on his patients. Sometimes the patient may hide or disguise vengeful feelings, given the condemnation and the social discredited aspect. Therapists should be alert even to the absence of these feelings, when they would be justified by the circumstances. Therapists should inquire and explore the reality aspects of the injury. In this way, the therapist's acknowledgement of reality, of what actually happened to the patient in detail, symbolically represents the therapist's belief in society's moral obligation to its members. By insisting on hearing the explicit details of the injury, something that is often painful to the therapist as well, the therapist is opening up a space that had previously collapsed under the discreditation of the emotion of vengefulness. Therapists should aim at a balance between resonating deeply to the patient's injury and his vengeful feelings on the one hand, and not reinforcing the patient's experience of victimhood, which can lead to ongoing bitterness and paralysis of will. While most of the theories about psychotherapy stress acceptance, warmth, compassion towards patients, there are a number of theorists, especially Winnicott and Harold Searles, who have opened up the space for the negative feelings towards the patient on the part of the therapist. Winnicott wrote about hate and the countertransference, and Harold Searles describes how some patients can sadistically torture their therapists, and that it's important not to ignore this. In recent years, the development of relational theories has led to a view of the encounter in therapy as to be seen as an encounter, as a meeting between two subjects, and the injunction on the therapist to experience and act only in a supportive voice has been questioned. The implication here is that in the therapy itself, vengefulness, both as a wish is sometimes acted out on the part of the therapist as well as on the part of the patient, and is indeed grist for the mill. What I'm saying here is that the transference sometimes includes vengeful wishes and vengeful acts. I want to give an example from my own practice. I recently forgot a session. Somebody turned up and I wasn't there. And I couldn't figure out why it happened. It doesn't happen very often. I realized that in talking about it to the patient afterwards, and in the previous session, she had talked about my aging, about the possibility of my forgetting as an act of vengeance, unacknowledged. I am so conditioned and socialized to believe that I should be able to accept the intimations of my aging and mortality with professional equanimity. Of course I couldn't and didn't like it that she was pointing it out to me, so I extracted my revenge by not turning up for the next sessions. To the reality of the injury, as well as the manifestation of vengefulness in the patient-therapist relationship, can release psychic energy that is otherwise curbed. Okay? I'm missing the page.
Did you forget it?
There's something in this page.
Okay, what the page was meant to talk about. And I think what I wanted to say here, and here I'm speaking extempore, is that the group is the world in microcosm. There is a need on the part of people who have been injured, who have suffered trauma at the hands of other human beings, for them to tell the story and to have the group witness the story. There's a need also for them to tell on the people, to tell about the people who have done them injury. And a group, as a microcosm of society, bears witness and participates vicariously in the suffering. This is something that is unique to group therapy. It's different from individual therapy, where an individual therapist can give acknowledgement of the validity of vengeful feelings. But in a group, if vengeful feelings are acknowledged by other people and understood and shared, this has a greater impact. The group also allows one who has suffered to, the group, of course, needs to be able to provide a safe holding environment where judgmentalism is suspended and careful attention is paid to each individual whose strengths and vulnerabilities are noticed and accepted. The groups also allow for the normalization and the universalization of vengeful feelings. Other people feel vengeful as well, not only one person, and it is a part of normal human experience, not to be discredited. To recap in brief, what am I saying here? Psychodynamic therapy, which aims at change and at healing hatred, espouses paradoxically that only by acknowledging hatred and vengeful feelings, without shame, without guilt, can we begin to establish the conditions for change, for healing hatred. Neutralizing the shame is crucial. A supportive, non-judgmental environment where psychological safety is paramount is necessary for this work. Vengeful feelings represent a desire to reconnect, to belong to the world in which wrongs are condemned. This unequivocal condemnation, coming from one's peers, is necessary in order to begin the moving process of separating to a certain extent from the hated and persecuted source of the injustice. Therapists are trained to detect vengefulness, which is in hiding, to ferret it out, and to allow the individual to accept himself as somebody with revengeful feelings. This, I have said, is a necessary first step. And what about the other steps? This is what we call mourning and working through. But about that, another lecture, another day.
Yeah. She's not entirely an uninterested partner, nor am I, in as much as with full disclosure, I happen to be on the board of the Rossing Centre. But it's an opportunity for me, however, on this occasion, to congratulate her and her team for the wonderful work that the Rossing Centre does. And which would have made Daniel Rossing of blessed memory extremely proud to see how his fledgling initiative has become such an important organisation in the life of the country as a whole and in the field of interfaith relations. So I've been asked specifically to address the religious dimension under this particular topic. Now you've heard, if what I could say, due to this rather apple toffee British accent, I could tell you've just heard two colonial accents. But it is precisely the context of the last colonial accent that you heard that I wish to make reference, because some of you will be a little familiar with my background, but those who are not, and you don't have it on the bio that you have provided for you, I was Chief Rabbi of Ireland, but before that I was Rabbi of South Africa, and at the height of apartheid, until the government at that time had enough of me, at least simply didn't renew my visa, and then Sharon and I went on our continuing travels around the world. But those were very formative years in South Africa, and it's also appropriate, especially because of Father Michael's central role to this whole event, that I refer to it. But it was really not only formative in terms of my own vocation, but in terms of my understanding of some of these psychological aspects and even perhaps tactical aspects that have been so important for me in terms of my work in interfaith relations and insights into processes that facilitate a certain amount of change. I came to interfaith relations out of a commitment to social justice. I can't say, even as a rabbi, even though I came from an enlightened, modern Orthodox background in England, I came to study in Israel, and I served twice in the military, both as a soldier and then as the chaplain. Actually, I was Moses' successor, because we refer to Moses as Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our rabbi, and to the best of my knowledge, being Moses our rabbi and this rabbi, there was no rabbi on a regular basis on West Sinai, and now it's back with the Egyptians, so I don't have much competition for the claim. But I had never really been particularly interested in interfaith relations. It had never occurred to me. But in South Africa, it was really important for me, as we were there at the height of apartheid in the 70s, to be engaged in trying to not only play a little part for the time that we were there, but above all to bring my own community, the Jewish community, into action, to try to overcome in some way the iniquities, the travesties of what was called the colour bar. And one of the few ways you could get people together across the racial divide was through religion. The government was a little more cagey, and I started to hawk my wares around to establish what became known as the Interfaith Forum. It was the first council of Christian Muslims and Jews, certainly in South Africa, and probably one of the first of its kind in the world at that particular time. And I had a gambit which had worked perfectly well. You know, bishop, father, pastor, sheikh, imam. The things that bring us together are so much more important than the things that keep us apart. And they had all agreed, and they agreed to become part of this particular initiative. But I knew in the South African context, particularly at the time, that if I did not involve the Dutch Reformed Church, which was affectionately or less affectionately known as the Nationalist Party of Prayer, if I didn't involve it in this particular endeavour, then it was going to be of limited consequence. So I heard about a dominee downtown, a pastor of the Dutch Reformed Church, downtown Cape Town, who was having dialogue with Catholics. That will not impress you very much, for most of you who do not know the Dutch Reformed Church demonology of South Africa of that era, which had two great dangers. One was the Swart Gevaar, the black danger, and the other was the Roemense Gevaar, the Catholic danger of the Antichrist, of the Pope. And therefore I thought, if this guy's having a dialogue with Catholics, maybe he would be prepared to meet a Jew as well. Rather naive I was. So nevertheless, he did graciously accept to meet me. I went and kept my appointment, and I presented him that opening gambit. You know, Domini, the things that bring us together are so much more important than things that keep us apart. And to my surprise, he responded to me, I have to do this with a heavy South African accent. No, Rabbi, I cannot agree with you. The most important thing in my life keeps us apart. My belief in Jesus as my personal Redeemer. You do not share that, Rabbi. Therefore, Rabbi, you are going to burn in hell. And I can only meet you if it is my Christian duty to save you. Fortunately, I didn't lose my cool. It was quite surprising considering how young and unexperienced I was. And I said to him something which actually was almost something inspired, because I really only came to appreciate it subsequently. I said to him, well, Dominique, thank you very much for your honesty. I think this is very important for you to come along to our meetings. I would like you to understand me better, and I would like to understand you better. But Dominique, now after what you've told me, you have to come, because I'm giving you an opportunity to convert me, and it's your Christian duty to come to these meetings. But what was really interesting about this is he did come. I don't know whether my gambit had worked, but as he came, he became less, if I can mix my denominational metaphors, less pontificatory, and he became more engaged and open to dialogue and brought other people with. And this was really, I think, the salient message for me in what was this person's transformation. Maybe not a particularly dramatic one, though in the South African context then, and within the Dutch Reformed Church, it was nothing to sneeze at. And that was that the human encounter provides the greatest opportunities for change. When we can meet one another on a genuine basis of respect, when I can encounter the other, if I may say, within the theological language, as a child of God, recognizing the other, creating a divine image, the capacities for change are unlimited. Of course, this whole episode was enormously salutary for me personally. First of all, it introduced me to the whole world of interfaith relations. I realized how important it was. I met these Christians who I thought, if you're a Christian, then you're bound to know what Judaism is, your roots, and you know the Jewish people, etc. And I discovered these Christians were not only amazingly ignorant, they had all these crazy, weird prejudices about Jews and Judaism. And the Muslims knew even less. And therefore it was critically important, if I wanted to combat prejudice, that I encountered with them. It was in my own enlightened self-interest. But to tell you the truth, I realized as I spoke to them that I had amazingly ignorant misconceptions about them. And if I wanted them to understand me, I needed to understand them, and therefore I had to be engaged in this particular process. So it was particularly salutary. But my main emphasis here is that the human encounter has the power, the capacity for the most amazing transformation, if we are open to it. And we need to find the ways in which one can actually overcome all those barriers and suspicions that keep the possibility of that encounter at bay. To quote Pope Francis, to change a person's heart, we first have to embrace him. And that, I think, is the central idea, which is very difficult to do, especially when you're caught in the context of conflict. I know that too well, both from the South African context, from Ireland, where we lived for 6 years. In fact, places generally improve when we leave. There's now a move to try to get me out of Jerusalem. Maybe that will have some impact on the situation here. But if we can overcome those sources of alienation, the real power is within that human encounter. And we see it in so many different ways here as well. I mean, I'm here to look specifically at the religious dimension of that. Here, probably the greatest impact has come within, if you like, more secular frameworks, and one of the workshops that I didn't attend of the Parents Bereaved Circle, I think is also a demonstration of the power of that encounter, of how it can change. In South Africa, there was a particularly wonderful person during my time, and my time was, I think, not concurrent with Father Michael's. There was a wonderful, great hero of the apartheid struggle by the name of Dr. Beyers Naudé. He was a Dutch Reform minister, and he founded what the Christian Institute, which played a very important role at a very critical time in a struggle against apartheid. He was a Dutch Reform minister from the heart of the nationalist Dutch Reform core, hardcore. And it was only when he encountered personally the real suffering that blacks endured under apartheid that he realized he had to change not just his practical modus operandi, but he had to change his theology. And that led to this enormous transformation. So it's not just the human encounter, but especially when we encounter the pain of the other, that can facilitate significant transformations. I would say in our context especially, and it's got to do with things we've already heard about, very often our own pain prevents us from being able to empathize with the pain of the other. I remember when George Carey was here, before he became Archbishop of Canterbury, he came with a question at a very important seminar we had about 25, maybe 30 years ago at Tanzor. And his big question was, can we overcome our pain? And that's, I think, the big challenge. And I think it's got worse here. I don't think our capacity to overcome our pain has been facilitated. But the human encounter has these amazing capacities, and long before this program that Sarah described to us so detailed and interestingly this morning, there was something here that was initiated by a Sister Marie Goldstein more than 30 years ago here, that were known as Hope Seminars. And these were probably the first encounters of their kind of young and old Muslims, Christians and Jews, where the methodology was not to argue or to debate, but to resonate. And therefore resonation was its methodology, and I think it was very impactful for those who are involved. In parenthesis, I have to say that's the case for virtually everything we do. Those of us who delude ourselves into thinking that our very important work in dialogue and encounter and in understanding can transform the political reality, or that interreligious engagement can transform the political reality, are deluding ourselves. It's no less important, however, because we can't change a situation. It is a testimony to what is possible. It's preparation for the morning after, which one day will come. We are essentially precisely that still small voice, the prophetic testimony, as I say, no less important, but nevertheless ultimately dependent upon the political transformation before the enormous richness and capacities that we're able to develop can truly bear fruit. There are, of course, other aspects to transformation, religious transformation. There are plenty of well-known international examples, whether they be Cat Stevens or Muhammad Ali. Cat Stevens is actually an interesting example. This, I think, we see in many cases of so-called religious conversion, of people who feel a void in their lives and therefore are seeking for meaning and purpose. And religion provides that with a unique intensity. Of course, there are plenty of negative aspects to that intense provision that religion provides, and some of these have already been addressed in great detail this morning. But the sense of purpose that an individual can have is enormous. Cat Stevens was an enormously successful pop singer, extremely wealthy, but felt that all of it meant nothing. It was, to use the words of Solomon, vanity of vanities. And he wanted something of deeper spiritual purpose, and thus converted and became a devout Muslim. There's an example that some of you may know of a very lovely, and of course not atypical of many American Jews who have even lived within the community, and not just of American Jews, but there happens to be a disproportionate amount of Americans involved in this particular process. even though now more and more Israelis, are visiting India and new parts, religious, cultural encounters, and discovering spirituality for the first time, which they had not discovered within their own particular communities. Sharon and I have a very good friend who is the right-hand woman of one of the most important swamis in India today, who was doing her doctorate in California, and she'd had her bat mitzvah in a congregation, and had grown up in quite a typical congregation there, but her first real encounter, she says, with some sense of divinity, something transcendent, was when she was in India. And that has given the content and the purpose and the meaning to her life. Then there are, of course, individuals who encounter trauma. I've to some extent alluded to that, but we see this all the more in jails. You see conversion taking place in jails quite dramatically from different denominations, different religious traditions. Once again, the search for meaning and purpose for those whose lives, for many, have reached some kind of, if you like, moral, spiritual dead end. Some of these have been particularly fascinating. There's an example, I can't remember the man's surname, but there was an aide to Martin McGuinness when I was Chief Rabbi of Ireland. Martin McGuinness was somebody I actually encountered. I'll tell you the story in a moment if I haven't overdone my time entirely. And he had an assistant by the name of Alistair, who in jail underwent this particular conversion, totally transformed his view of the conflict. In fact, he didn't understand the conflict. The idea of the violence that had been part of his life beforehand no longer had any meaning, because he had found, if you like, a higher purpose, and that happened to him in jail. Martin McGuinness was somebody I didn't actually know personally, but I only in retrospect did I discover I had met. During the height of the Troubles in Ireland, some of you old enough may remember there was an H-Block crisis. This was when Irish Republican prisoners in the north wanted to get political status and were not being granted by the British authorities, and they went on a hunger strike. And the first of these was a gentleman by the name of Bobby Sands. And Bobby Sands' life was drawing to an end, and one Sabbath afternoon, Shabbat afternoon, I was resting at home and the doorbell went in Dublin, so I knew it was nobody from the Jewish community, because nobody from the Jewish community would have rung the bell. But I went to the door. They were a bit surprised, because in Ireland, the chief rabbi was on par with the archbishop and the cardinal, and they were expecting to come through a few different secretaries before they would get to me. And because I had national broadcasts, they knew what I looked like. I didn't know what the people who I met on the doorstep looked like. But they said to me, "Good afternoon, Rabbi. We're from the IRA, and we'd like to speak to you." Well, I wasn't going to argue with them, right? So I brought them into a living room, and they asked me to intervene with Margaret Thatcher on behalf of Bobby Sands. I said to them, "Why are you coming to me?" They said, "We're not going to a Protestant archbishop, and she's not going to listen to a Catholic cardinal. What's left is a Jewish chief rabbi." They probably said it a little more elegantly than that, but at any rate, it was part of my encounter. But of course, the Iron Lady wasn't for changing, and therefore Bobby Sands died, and the situation did not improve in that particular regard. But as I say, there were those who were jailed at that particular time, and their experience in jail, sense of futility of their own particular activity, led to these transformations. Perhaps I will conclude with the last thing. There is a very interesting work of a social scientist by the name of Douglas Marshall, and he refers to religion as being made up of 3 B's: beliefs, behavior, and belonging. And different religions in different places and different times are different combinations of these. But I think the B of belonging is particularly important. And I think very often we see converts, especially within Jewish context, more motivated to change their way of life by a connection with both individuals and with communities that give them a sense of purpose. And you see that, I think, also within other religions, where there are strong community identities. When I was on the Beth Din on Rabbinical Court in Cape Town, the head of the Beth Din there, a most wonderful man, a name of Rabbi Eugene Dushinsky, always preferred the motivation for conversion out of belonging than out of individual theological conviction. It's very interesting, because he felt that an ideological change was something that was not necessarily always stable, and was not always rooted. Whereas if it had to do with human connections and being part of relationships, whether individual relationships or broader relationships, they were more sustainable. If somebody would come along to the Beth Din and say they wanted to convert, and they're doing it purely out of ideological conversion, they had no experience of Jewish life, community life or other, he would say, "Well, my dear, I give you a blank check. when you find a nice Jewish boy or you find a nice Jewish girl, then come back and see me, and then we will talk about it again. This was actually a reflection of the fact that while transformations of an ideological and a spiritual aspect have enormous power and significance, in the end, to be sustainable, they need the community and the context, that sense of belonging, to fully nurture them. So I hope those thoughts are of some value, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your interesting insights in your field of work. And you really gave us also a very interesting perspective in the differences, in the challenge to deal with the context of political conflict. So what I learned is that we have to learn with negative feelings, that we have to acknowledge hatred feelings with a desire to see another suffer. So I think in Switzerland, in our Western culture, our understanding of spirituality and spiritual counseling is mainly focused on positive feelings, such as feeling peace, living in harmony, and well-being. And so what I think that in the context of political conflict, the understanding of spirituality is much more than an aspect of well-being. It's rather considered to be a primary coping resource in the journey of recovery and healing, and includes also overcoming trauma. So spiritual care might lead to a process where people develop a new consciousness of themselves and the world they live in. And now I would like to know, so how can you as clinicians support patients in this process? So I would like to ask you, Professor Wall.
I'd like to relate to three important notions which were mentioned by my predecessor. Dr. Oppenheimer mentioned the notion of vengefulness, and Rabbi Rosen, human encounter and transformation. Let me give you some biographical notes about myself. I graduated from medical school in Jerusalem, and then I joined the army. And I was a paratrooper. I was officer of the paratroopers. I'm now Lieutenant Colonel in Reserve. And in my military service, which was very active, I participated actively in 3 wars, and very numerous commander operation in enemy territory. And our neighbors, our Arabs, were, for me, the image of the Arab was one of the enemy. And this followed me for many years. As a matter of fact, we just celebrated 50 years, celebrated more than 60 years of the 50 years of the 60 War. And then, like many young Israelis, I was taken by the euphoria of coming back, to the biblical scenes and to the homeland of the Jewish people, ignoring completely that this was not an empty land, that there were people living there. But there were, to me and to many others, and unfortunately today, again to many people, they were transparent. And then I joined the organization called Physicians for Human Rights, and one of the activities we have there, one of the main activities, is having every weekend a mobile clinic going to a small Arab Palestinian village where there is a disaster lack of medical services. There is a lack of infrastructure. There are villages with 5,000 souls where a doctor is coming once or twice a week for a couple of hours. So we have every weekend a group of Israeli doctors, 10 to 12 Israeli doctors, and we establish a mobile clinic in this village, and we treat 300-400 people every time. We bring with us a mobile pharmacy, and we distribute medication free of charge, because amongst others, there's a very serious problem of unemployment and poverty in the population. And we see many of them with critical chronic disease who cannot afford to buy medication. We see people with hypertension and diabetes who are terribly neglected because they can't afford to buy medication. So we distribute them, and on this day we create, as you mentioned, the notion of human encounter, we managed to create an incredible atmosphere, a microcosmos of understanding of goodwill, which is very unique in the regular encounters of Palestinians. Once you know that the regular encounter of Palestinians with Israeli, the most prevalent encounter is a very unpleasant, very brutal one. It is with the poor soldier whom I pity was standing in 7 hours in the sun on a checkpoint, or it is the Secret Service, the Israeli Secret Service who taking the dead out of the bed at 2 a.m., or is the settlers who cut the olive trees. And for a change, they have the opportunity to meet another Israeli who is friendly to them, who looks at them high level, and we may not change the medical condition in Palestine by doing this operation, but we create a notion that there is some hope, there is some light at the end of the tunnel. And you may remember that quite a few years ago there was a horrible massacre at the mosque at in Hebron, at the temple of the fathers, which is a mosque and the grave of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it was used as a mosque, and the Israeli, I'm ashamed to say Israeli doctor, went to this mosque and massacred 39 people doing their prayers. And on the weekend following this horrible massacre, we were scheduled to have this mobile clinic going to a Palestinian village. And everybody told me, this is crazy. I mean, the tension was at its highest. It is absolutely insane to go there. And we decided, in spite of it, we will go there. And we went to this mobile clinic, and we carried on this mobile clinic, and we were met with warmth, and we were welcomed to this village. So we're talking about the sense of vengefulness, where we could see that the Arabs who treated us with this fraternity, with this warmth, did not show up any feeling of vengefulness in spite of everything which happened. It could very well make a difference between those who are the enemies and those who treat them in a humane way and stretch a hand toward them. And so, talking about transformation again, this attitude which I had toward the Arabs for many years, were, as a military, were considered as a symbol of the enemy. I underwent this transformation, and I consider them now as our neighbors and people with whom we could absolutely, we should create friendly relations. And I've been doing it for more than 20 years. And time and again, I meet with Palestinians who are so willing to create a friendly and a good atmosphere, a friendly relationship with Israelis. And it's not only the people who treat these mobile clinics. Every time we have the visit of the mayor of the city, of the governor of the district who come then. We had a couple of years ago a huge operation in which we provided hearing aids to no less than 2,000 Palestinians. Deafness is extremely prevalent in the Arab population amongst others because consanguinity, married within the family, so it's extremely prevalent. And you can imagine the fate of a young Arab boy who is deaf, but he has no chance at all, any social mobility. All he can do, become his beggar in the souk. And we provided this hearing aids. So it was a huge operation. And we had the visit of the, amongst other, on the first day of this operation, we had a group of Palestinian special forces, which was called at the time Force 17, Koach Shvaiz. You may have heard about it, Israeli know about it. The Koach Shvaiz, the Unit 17, was considered to be the elite force of the Fatah, the fiercest enemy one can imagine of Israel. And the first time we started this operation, it was in the township of Tulkarem, and we had a few hundred people coming there. And then a group of the Force 13, the uniform, the machine guns, came to the courtyard. Some of us were a bit worried, and then these people came to us and said, listen, we've come not to protect you because you don't need protection, you are welcome here. We've come to help you. And these tough guys with the machine gun worked as ushers and carried, the equipment we needed, and just helped us to create this operation. So I consider this not only not just a humanitarian, but I consider this activity I'm carrying on and all my friends as a duty as a devoted Jew. I think this is one of the most important duties and most important message Judaism is carrying to humanity. You know that caring of the stranger, which is called the ger in the stranger, having the obligation to take care of the rights of the ger is mentioned in the Torah not less than 36 times. 36 times. More than any other mitzvah you can imagine. More than Shabbat, certainly more than Kashrut and many others. And I think it is our duty as Jews to take care of the ger, of the stranger who's living within us. And this, again, is what I consider as my duty as a Jew.
Thank you very much. It's interesting, this transformation process. I would like to know, how is it and what possibilities do you have in your country to support also the interprofessional cooperation, between physicians and psychologists and between rabbis?
There was about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, an organization to promote meetings between mental health professionals, Israelis and Palestinians. And today there's an organization called Psychoactive, which is an offshoot of that. But Professor Regular, I don't think that we have developed here a great deal of cooperation between the professions. I must say that I found the descriptions, both Professor Walden and Rabbi Rosen, I found the prescriptions very meaningful, very evocative, and very convincing. As a psychologist, it's very hard to directly change people unless you want to use conditioning techniques, which is not the way I and many others work. It's easier to establish the conditions which will make it easier for somebody to change. And sometimes the trauma alone is enough, and sometimes the holding environment, the permission, the lack of judgmentalism allows people to find their voice. There's a theme that was mentioned in Ruchama's workshop this morning.
So I think, Professor Gasser, you are exposing, if I'm translating literally from the Hebrew here, you are exposing our nudity, in other words, our failures and limitations. I think there are two particular points that are important to mention. One is the reality of the Kulturkampf that is part of the nature of Israeli society. It's changing, it's not the same as it was, but generally speaking, there is, and of course I would say probably the vast majority of Israelis who are here in the room are a negation and a refutation of this Kulturkampf. But generally speaking, there is an mutual alienation and even mutual suspicion on the part of those segments of Israeli society that define themselves as religious on the one hand and secular on the other. And this reveals itself also in inter-group activity. So that those organizations, once again, with the organizations involved here probably certain as exceptions to the rule, but nevertheless, generally speaking, intercultural organizations that involve Jews and Arabs together tend to be bereft of people who are deeply committed to religious practice and their own particular heritage. And those where there is engagement of people deeply committed to their religious heritages normally are not terribly interested in having people from a more secular society within them. So there is a problem, and this is a very simplistic, but nevertheless I think an important generalization of part of the problematics of Israeli society in terms of interdisciplinary cooperation. But I would like to highlight one particular organization in terms of also now what Dr. Oppenheimer has mentioned. And I think one of the important areas of activity of intergroup and interreligious organizations here is precisely the expression of solidarity with the other. And one of the most important organizations, I think, and I'm not objective because I'm one of its founders, but then there are two Reform rabbis in this room who are its founders, and there's a conservative rabbi who is very prominent in the work of this organization today, but I think was the second generation of this organization's work, and that is the Organization Rabbis for Human Rights. Incidentally, whenever I was criticized for working in the Organization Rabbis for Human Rights, it was rarely because I cared about Palestinian human rights, it was because I was working with Reform rabbis. In my circles, that was considered a far bigger sin. But I think one of the most important things of the work of Rabbis for Human Rights is it's really important work out in the field, is giving Palestinians a sense of solidarity. And of course, from our own particular perspective, at least it's shattering the stereotype that Professor Waldam referred to, that the Jew is not simply to be seen in this dominating, let alone domineering role, but also as one who's empathic, engaged, and supportive. Of course, it doesn't actually tend to lead to a desire for interreligious engagement on the other side. From the point of view of Palestinians, it's simply then taking advantage from their perspective, perfectly legitimate advantage, of those who are helping promote their agenda. But that, I think, is perfectly legitimate in its own right as well. Nevertheless, the solidarity that is experienced not only shatters stereotypes, but I think also nurtures some sense of hope. And that, very often, is the greatest contribution that we can